Boudica, the Queen of Victory, the oldest British servant, and one of Chaldea's top chefs. But what about the Boudica of Fate Grand Order? How well does she compare to her historical counterpart, and what grade would I give her depiction? Let's get into it. Boudica is a rider class servant, which does work, but it's not the best choice. Boudica is routinely depicted as riding a chariot, and so her getting one in FGO isn't strange. No, my dig at Boudica being a rider has nothing to do with her qualifications. She easily qualifies as a rider. It has to do with temperament, because there is another class that is, in my opinion, a far better match for Boudica, Avenger. I'll get into the details of Boudica's story later in this video, but the gist of it is, Avenger is a class that Boudica is made for. Now, the game does recognize this on a few occasions, most notably in Summer 2, except in that case it was being played for laughs, that she had become an Avenger because she didn't get a swimsuit despite featuring in a popular craft essence during Summer 1, and not because of anything in her actual backstory, which very much justifies her as a potential Avenger. Anyway, while Rider is fine, Avenger would be better. Getting into her character design, Boudica, particularly in her first ascension, needs some more clothes. Look, I know some of what the fanbase is into, but there's a time and place for that, you know? In the histories, Boudica is described as being tall with a scary appearance, reddish-brown hair down to her hips, a long cloak fastened by a brooch, and a multicolored tunic. The closest they get to all of that is in her third ascension, but even that is questionable. That corset thing she wears doesn't work. Nor does the shield. The ancient Britons left us a number of shields, and they don't look like the one Boudica has here. Worse, the red and gold coloring on that third ascension shield? That's closer to what the Romans would have. Boudica in art and fiction tends to be given a much more savage sort of appearance, leaning into the image of her as a warrior queen. And while I understand that creative license is a thing, the design here barely connects to that legacy. Overall, Boudica's design is pretty bad, though the third ascension at least leans in the right direction. Moving into her skill set, Boudica's first skill is Vow to the Goddess, which turns into Queen of Victory after an upgrade. Vow to the Goddess increases her damage against Roman enemies by a whopping 60% for 3 turns, while Queen of Victory makes this a party-wide buff while also adding increased crit damage for 3 turns. The anti-Roman damage in particular makes this a solid lore-relevant skill for Boudica, though I wish that she had some way to personally apply the Roman trait to enemies, and not be dependent upon a limited SSR to do it for her. As for the name, the goddess being referred to here is Andraste, an Iceni goddess of victory, war, and courage, and whose favor was often sought out by leaders hoping for a boost to their legitimacy. Andraste is the goddess whose favor Boudica sought prior to the start of her revolt, and so this is very much a solid connection. As for the upgrade, Boudica has become known as the Queen of Victory, but I'll hold off on digging into that for now. Boudica's second skill is Battle Continuation, which becomes nourishment for the battlefield after an upgrade. Battle Continuation gives a Guts that lasts for 5 turns, while Nourishment for the battlefield makes this a targetable Guts that also increases that single ally's HP for 5 turns as well. Battle Continuation is a generic skill we just saw in Heracles, and we'll see again plenty more times. In Boudica's case it does fit to a degree, since she picked herself back up from what the Romans did to her and her family to lead the revolt. Her determination to fight back, even against an empire as mighty as Rome, is the justification given to her having this skill. And you know what? That sounds good to me. As for the upgrade name, Nourishment for the Battlefield, that seems to tie into Boudica's whole bit with food and cooking, which she certainly does plenty of in FGO. I'll also address that later in this video. Lastly, Boudica's third skill is Andraste's Protection, which increases the art's card effectiveness for all party members for 3 turns. Like the first skill, this is referring to the Iceni goddess Andraste, whose favor Boudica sought out during her rebellion. I already talked about Andraste when covering the first skill, so there really isn't much more for me to say. Honestly, this feels kinda lazy to have 2 skills related to the same exact thing. Couldn't this be, I don't know, something burn related? Boudica did set cities on fire. Boudica's noble phantasm is Chariot of Boudica, whereupon she mounts her chariot, then circles around your allies to give them some buffs. This MP increases the defense of all allies for 3 turns, adds a further defense buff lasting for 1 turn dependent upon overcharge, as well as an attack buff for 3 turns also based upon overcharge. Now, this MP is basically just a weaker version of MASH's own MP, which seems like an awful design decision because everyone gets MASH in their Chaldea, and so makes Boudica's MP feel irrelevant. But what about the lore? Well, I already talked about Boudica having ridden a chariot when talking about why she gets the rider class. She rode around upon one to encourage her troops in battle. Boudica was a queen after all, rather than a frontline fighter, even if the latter image tends to be more exciting. So having her MP give buffs to allies is a solid choice. I just wish that it didn't overlap with MASH's own MP, you know? Boudica's craft essence is thirst for victory, depicting Boudica's sword planted in the grass in front of a wheel, likely from her chariot. The CE's text gives us more context for what this is about. It talks about how, despite her now being known as the Queen of Victory, Boudica's rebellion ultimately was a failure. Nevertheless, despite that, her story has lived on and continues to inspire those who seek to resist tyranny and foreign invaders. Normally I'd do this in characterization, but during the Renaissance, when classical Greek and Roman works were rediscovered in Western Europe, that included the histories of Tacitus and Cassius Dio, the two who wrote about Boudica. Now while they were both Romans, and so presented Boudica as a rebel, when the British read Boudica's story over a millennium after the fall of Western Rome, they saw things quite differently. Instead, Boudica became a symbol of Britain's resistance against foreign invaders, and her memory would be invoked again and again in the following centuries whenever a foreign enemy seemed to be threatening Britain, notably during the days of Francis Drake and the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, and beyond. Back to the CE, while this may be pretty simple and straightforward, not all CEs need to be more than that. This is a good one. Boudica's Valentine CE is Victory Rose, depicting a cake with some roses made of frosting decorating the top. Now, aside from making me wish I had some cake right now, this is clearly leaning into Boudica's characterization as one of Chaldea's kitchen crew servants. And since we are on the subject, is there anything about Boudica that suggests she might be an amazing chef? No, there isn't. The sad fact is, we know much about Boudica's actions, but next to nothing about the sort of person she was outside of being a queen. I'm fine with her being depicted as a great cook if it means she gets more screen time, but it has nothing to do with her historical counterpart. Now for characterization, starting with a summary of the historical Boudica. When I made that poll in the community tab asking if viewers wanted me to continue giving summaries of the backstories of servants, the response was an overwhelming yes. But that was in the context of my covering characters from fiction or mythology, stories that may not be too well known. When it comes to historical servants, summarizing the lives of giants like Caesar or Napoleon is going to be, well, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. I mean, you could probably make an entire YouTube channel just about Caesar or Napoleon. Thankfully, Boudica's time in the historical record is comparatively brief, and so I can go into detail without making this video stupidly long. However, part of the reason for that is because we only really have two sources for Boudica, the Roman historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio I mentioned earlier. Now, not only were neither of these two contemporaries of Boudica, both of them are Romans, not Britons. Remember when in my video on Taigong Wang I said that the further back in history you go, the more problematic things get because you have fewer and fewer records, and so things become more prone to bias and uncertainty? Well, here we are, except this time we are covering Boudica, whose history was literally written by the victors. Tacitus seems okay for Boudica, though. His bias was against some specific Roman emperors, notably Nero. Anyway, the gist of this is to keep in mind that the information we have on Boudica is limited, and it doesn't come from people who knew her personally. Tacitus was 5 years old when Boudica died, and Cassius Dio wouldn't even be born for another century. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe, which was based in what is now the region of East Anglia in Britain. Her husband was the king of the Iceni tribe, Prasutagus, and together they had 2 daughters. By all accounts, they seem to have lived a pleasant life together, even if the times that they lived in were troubled. How troubled? Well, it was the 1st century in Britain, meaning that they had to contend with a superpower on the continent, the Roman Empire. Worse, this was not the dying Roman Empire like in the time of Altera, Vortigern, or King Arthur, but one that was at the height of its power and still growing, and that growth was coming into Britain. Starting in the year 43 CE, when Boudica was in her teens, the Romans under Emperor Claudius began the conquest of Britain, and this would continue into the reign of the next emperor, Nero. Now, when you think of the word conquest, you likely are imagining gigantic armies marching in, laying waste to everything that opposed them, and setting up their own people and cities. This wasn't quite the case, though. The Roman approach in Britain, and in many other places, was to make alliances with local leaders, letting them govern themselves, and providing protection from other hostile tribes. But in exchange, it was common for these leaders to leave their lands to Rome after their death, and so, bit by bit, the Roman Republic and later Empire expanded. This was the case for the Iceni tribe too, but Prasutagus hoped that his family could still have something after he was gone. Shortly before his death in the year 60 CE, Prasutagus named the Emperor Nero as his heir, as expected, but also his 2 daughters, hoping that his family could at least have something for the future. The Romans looked at the will Prasutagus had left behind and decided, now we're going to take it all. To further emphasize the point, they marched into Iceni territory, occupied the lands of the former king, and seized money that had been gifted to the Iceni by the Emperor Claudius, now claiming that they were loans that needed to be repaid with interest. When Boudica protested this, she was flogged and her daughters were raped. Now, we don't know exactly how old Boudica was, but it is believed that she would have been in her early to mid-30s, having gotten married at 18 or so, meaning that her daughters couldn't have been older than their mid-teens. Even by the brutal standards of the ancient world, what the Romans did here was disgusting. Why they decided to do it isn't clear, but since the governor of Britannia was off in Wales with 2 legions suggests that it was some lower-level official's idea, and not a very smart one at that. After all, Britons weren't exactly happy with Roman domination, and now they had just given one of its leaders a very deep and very personal reason to turn against them. Together with the other British tribes, Boudica rose in revolt against the Romans, amassing a substantial army. First heading to Camulodunum, the city had once been the capital of the Trinovantes tribe, but had since been turned into a colony for Roman military veterans. Since these veterans were accused of enslaving and abusing the native Britons, it was an obvious first target for retribution. Boudica's army defeated the small force defending it and destroyed the city. Next was Londinium, a city founded less than 20 years prior, but which was already becoming a major hub for trade. The Romans did not have enough forces to defend the city, and so were forced to abandon it, evacuating who they could, but much of the population remained. The Britons so devastated Londinium that even today, archaeologists refer to a layer of soil underneath London as Boudica's lair, soil consisting of burnt ash and remains from Roman times. The fate of the inhabitants was dark. The Britons were not interested in taking slaves or prisoners, and they took out their resentments upon the population, leading to many atrocities. Boudica's army would attack one more city, Verulamium, before the Roman legions that had been away in Wales finally arrived to confront her. It was here that Boudica's luck ran out, as she was now up against a proper professional army rather than civilians and what guards stood to fight her attacks. The Romans chose their position well, creating a head-on battle with no room for maneuver, and so nullifying the Britons' numerical advantage. Boudica's revolt ended that day, cut to pieces by the Roman army. As for Boudica herself, she is believed to have either died of illness or taken her own life after the defeat. Exact numbers are impossible to verify, but it is estimated that up to 80,000 civilians were killed by Boudica's army, whereas a similar number of Britons were said to have fallen in the final battle. The Romans would crack down hard in the aftermath, though the Emperor Nero would end up replacing Britannia's governor, feeling that the punitive measures would only lead to another revolt. Even so, as I mentioned before when talking about her craft essence, Boudica's memory would persist through the ages, eventually becoming a symbol of British resistance to foreign domination that would inspire for centuries to come, and continues to do so. Now, there is a reason why I went into detail about Boudica and the historical legends surrounding her, and that is to make sure that all of you are working from the same base of information. With that established, you might be having some ideas as to what kind of characterization Boudica ought to have in Fate Grand Order. You may also now understand why I put forth the argument that she would be better off as an avenger rather than a rider. Boudica is someone who had a good life, saw it shattered by the cruelties of the Romans, and spent the rest of her life wreaking a terrible vengeance upon any Roman she could find. Admittedly, we know little of the finer details of her life, like whether or not she was an amazing cook, for example. But at the very least, we know 2 things. Boudica hates the Romans for what they did, and that she inflicted great violence against them in turn. Now, I would like you to imagine a situation where Boudica decides to set aside her grudge and team up with the Romans. Now, if you are lacking in creativity and are struggling to imagine such a scenario, especially in the light of having heard Boudica's story, I have 2 pieces of good news for you. The first is that you are in good company. I don't have much creativity either. I mean, I can't even figure out what kind of banner to put up for this YouTube channel. And you think I can imagine an entire world where someone acts blatantly out of character and sides with her mortal enemy? That's absurd. But the second piece of good news is that we don't actually have to imagine such a situation, because instead we can go look at Septem and see it for ourselves. Boudica's first and currently only major main story appearance is in the Septem Singularity, where she is serving as a general under the command of Emperor Nero, the very same Roman emperor that Boudica revolted against. Indeed, the Singularity takes place in the year 60 CE, the very year that Boudica's revolt took place. Since history is a little iffy on whether or not the revolt carried over into 61 CE or not, technically Boudica could still be alive in this Singularity. Oh, and for extra comedy, her fellow general is Spartacus, leader of Rome's most famous slave revolt. Now, Boudica does say a few things about her curious choice of allegiance. She says that she still hates the Romans, but that the enemy in Septem, the United Empire, is even worse. Boudica also mentions that she feels regret over how many innocents were killed during her revolt, and she decided to join the Romans to try to save innocent lives. Roman lives. Right, here's the problem with all of that. The United Empire that's worse than the Roman Empire Boudica revolted against? They're led by Romulus, the founder of Rome, and many of their generals, notably Caesar and Caligula, are also notable Romans. Hell, Caesar was the first Roman leader to invade Britain. So really, the conflict in the Septem Singularity is more like a Roman civil war, Romans against Romans. Why would Boudica be picking a side between Romans? As far as she ought to be concerned, they are both the people who invaded Britain, occupied her homeland, and committed atrocities against her people. As for Boudica feeling regret over the carnage her own revolt caused, I mean, it's not impossible, but at the same time, Boudica is also from the ancient world. In those days, letting your army loose in an enemy city to do whatever they liked to the civilian population wasn't the war crime it is rightfully seen as today. It was the norm. I mean, the Romans did it as a way to reward their soldiers, to let them gorge themselves on whatever they could loot or plunder. As screwed up as it may sound to our modern ears, Boudica feeling remorse over letting her armies do such things, and to a hated enemy no less, seems very unlikely. It would be transplanting modern values onto someone from another time, and in a franchise where we've seen clashes between masters and servants over their different values before, notably in Fate Zero between Artoria and Kiritsugu. Much like with Blackbeard and Okeanos, the writers have been trying to make up for Boudica's Septem depiction ever since. Pretty much in every event appearance she has made since, Boudica either expresses how much she hates Romans, or she is cooking food, or acting as a big sister to other British servants since she is the oldest one chronologically. I actually rather like that detail. But when Boudica does pop in to express her hatred of Romans, it's usually only for a scene or two in an event or interlude. Honestly, it feels like they are just trying to throw a bone at fans who are furious over her Septem depiction. Meanwhile, she shows up more often as a comedy or fun character, most recently in the Christmas 2023 event. Boudica is pretty angry in Summer 2, but that's played for comedy since she's mad about not getting a summer version, another source of anger I understand. Actually, it makes me wonder if there is a growing group of servants within Chaldea who are on the brink of revolt because they have been waiting years for their summer version, and yet have not gotten one despite there being clear demand for it. I wonder who leads that group. Boudica? Medusa? Medea? Ereshkigal? Maybe it's a council. Clearly this should be what Summer 9 is about, the attack of the neglected servants coming to take their long-awaited revenge. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Boudica's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Let's see. Her character design is awful aside from her third ascension, and even that is questionable. Her skill set is better at least from a lore perspective. I don't like that Boudica is dependent upon the 5-star Romulus to actually be useful. As for characterization, well, she can be a fun character to see in lighthearted events where she is cooking up food for everyone. But when it comes to actual serious storylines, it's an utter failure. I don't know who it was that signed off on allowing that depiction of Boudica in Septem, but they better hope Boudica can't be summoned as a servant for real, because if she was, I suspect that after torching Rome she would be coming straight for them. The developers have tried to make up for that ever since by having Boudica express her dislike of Romans regularly, but it's been too little and it doesn't wash away the stain of Septem, a stain that every player of FGO is required to experience since it is early in the main story. If they really wanted to do a redemption arc for Boudica where she gradually gets past her hatred of Romans, she should have started with that hatred and grew as a character from there, rather than the reverse like we get in FGO. For my part, I've long had my own thoughts on how I would rewrite or do Septem differently without making it overly ambitious. Perhaps that's a video I should do. Let me know if there's any interest in that. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Boudica, the Queen of Victory, an F. I know, what a huge surprise. I bet none of you saw that coming. Boudica torched cities and now cooks in Chaldea, but now she's the one on the menu. But to be honest, it's not Boudica who deserves the flame, but whoever wrote Septem. She deserves so much better than what she got in FGO. And if you would like to learn more about someone else who messes with fire a lot, check out my video on Oda Nobunaga here. Until next time.